Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all, and welcome to a very special edition of Office Hours. We're at a slightly earlier time, 4 p.m. rather than 5, but that's partly because we have a big event tonight, and my guest for the very first in-person live stream with a guest. My guest is going to be speaking about his new book later tonight. So before I introduce him, firstly, I want to thank all of you for coming in to Office Hours. I look forward to this every week as an opportunity to really check in, build community of practice and learning. And it's great to see already many of you coming in. As you know, you should like this stream so that others will find it on their feed in the algorithm and be boosted. You can subscribe to the channel, and you could share this on your social media platforms. If you're streaming on X, you can retweet it and make sure that comrades, friends, relatives, even enemies come into contact with this so that they can learn. Even your enemies, maybe even especially the enemies, need to hear this stuff. So I'm really delighted, though, to have this opportunity to continue a conversation that we had in a very kind of interesting discussion, a video that many of you have probably watched. If you haven't, you may want to go back and check out the Imperial Theory Industry with Gabriel Rockhill. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Gabriel Rockhill to our recording studio, my home, and to Kingston for a book launch event later tonight about his important book, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism. Gabriel, it's great to have you here. Thank you for coming a long distance.
It's wonderful to be here, especially in person, and to meet you for the first time in person, as well as to participate in this. So I'm excited about the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I mean, this conversation follows from a very successful event in Toronto yesterday where, many people came out. There was a very lively discussion. There was a panel discussion. And I also got a chance to meet some people who I've only known online in this space as well. So this has been facilitating good comradely contact socially, but also intellectually and politically. And that's what we want to continue and extend today in this discussion. So we've already had one conversation. And if you want to say anything else about your other work, we did an introduction in the other video, but if you want to let people know anything more about you, we can do that before we head into the conversation, but that's really up to you.
I don't have anything particular to note. I mean, I guess maybe one thing that I'd say is that I also, like you, am involved in a number of collective projects. So the Critical Theory Workshop is an educational nonprofit. We're running a class right now. We have a summer school that's coming up that's in Paris, but also online. And so if people check out criticaltheoryworkshop.org, it's a kind of portal to a lot of the different collective projects I'm involved in. So I'll just put a plug in for that.
Absolutely. And we'll put a link in the video so that people can follow up and learn more about that very important project. Following on our previous conversation, thinking about the Imperial Theory Industry, as you framed it, and we titled the last conversation, that one of the things that I wanted to pick up from there is if it's an industry, it produces commodities, and that's something that's very important for you to characterize theory as product. And you might say more about how that kind of analysis of theory as a commodity works. But in particular, there might be questions about, do you mean like authors and works, ideas, like what gets commodified? Are there differences in how commodities are sort of produced and so forth in their, within this industry? But really importantly, as we know, if anybody has read, Capital, Volume 1, very important in the analysis of commodities is distinguishing between exchange value and use value. And you put that concept very much. Oh, and thank you. We're getting replenished
Served
with coffee. Yes, this is great.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Is the difference between exchange value and use value when it comes to the commodities of the imperial theory industry?
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that's important to recognize in bourgeois culture is a tendency to bifurcate culture between high culture of theory and art and the low culture of entertainment for the masses. And this is a class distinction, of course. And we need to read it as such and understand how it operates, because it creates distinction for the consumers of those high cultural commodities. And one of the major limitations in the kind of bourgeois social scientific approach to culture is that it not only doesn't engage in a kind of class analysis, but it often ignores the way in which the products and the producers of high bourgeois culture function like an industry very much along the same lines as that of low culture. So in the case of people like Adorno and Horkheimer, who are critical of the culture industry, they'll focus on the entertainment, meaning the culture of the masses, but they will not apply that same logic to the culture that they produce and that they consume due to the naturalization of their own kind of cultural consumption, but then also the class hierarchies. And it's very important in undertaking a materialist analysis of culture to be able to analyze all culture as well as the class dynamics that are operative within it. And you see in the very distinction between high and low culture, usually what's operative is implicitly or explicitly the ideal and spiritual realm versus the material crass realm. And so there's an attempt to protect the products and producers of the high theoretical and artistic realm from the crass realm of economics or class warfare or even just economic forces in general. And what we need to do is bring the stars back down to earth, recognize that there isn't an ideal domain that functions independently of a material reality, and actually elucidate how material forces are operative course within the production of this high culture, which tends to be the culture of the middle layer, right? It's the culture that is funded and supported by the ruling class in order to prop up the distinct layer of the professional managerial class, as we'd call it today, and make them distinct from the masses of workers. And within that, one of the interesting things that I think is operative is that if you want to have a form of culture that rises above the material realm, then there are all of these ways in which the theory and art of this kind of higher stratum not only is based on being useless, but celebrates being useless, being disconnected from the crass interests of the material world. And it participates in a kind of symbolic economy of exchange. So anyone familiar with how grad school operates in the humanities, or how the kind of refined cocktail conversation of the middle layer operates, knows full well that the theoretical and cultural references don't really have use value for elucidating the world. They have exchange value for leveraging up someone's social status, giving them distinction, but also providing others with a sense that you really know bourgeois culture and how it operates. And it's very different than the use value of concepts in which you would use ideas in order to elucidate the world, actually understand how it materially works, and of course, ultimately leverage them to transform and change the world. So in my own work, when I realized that the distinction between use value and exchange value is very helpful when you apply it to the realm of ideas, because then you can clearly see when you read something or you hear someone speak, are they invested in elucidating the world, collectively educating ourselves and changing it, or are they using language and systems of symbols in order to perform their own intelligence, their distinction from the masses, to engage in bourgeois referentiality to then make themselves appear more marketable ultimately on the kind of general market. The last thing that I'd say is that you're absolutely right. It's not just that use value and exchange value is helpful for understanding the commodities that are being sold, but also the producers of those commodities, right? And whether or not you're an intellectual who is looking to leverage their symbolic and ultimately also just purely economic status, or you're an intellectual who's engaged in trying to be useful to the project of transforming the world for the better.
Yeah. So it seemed to me a very powerful kind of mode of analysis for capitalist, basically, idea and theory production. So that was really, a seminal kind of way of applying Marx's analysis of commodities to a realm that it's typically not been, thought of, but should. Right. But actually, that's the whole argument, that I would say the big contribution methodologically in some ways, and I think I may have mentioned this in our last conversation, is doing a political economy of, theory. And of academic production, of other forms of cultural production. And it's in some ways sort of surprising that this hasn't been as,
you would think.
And you would think also in some ways that these figures who did so much to talk about the operations of late consumer capitalism in the industrial West would have had some self-reflexive approach of grounding their own, ideas and production in some kind of wider framework. They didn't. And there may be many reasons why they couldn't or wouldn't that we could talk about. But you talk a lot about the networks and the foundations and the deep state and the patronage in some ways. And also, this is another interesting part when thinking about responses to your work, both to this book and other pieces that have sketched out some of this analysis elsewhere, that the responses to these tend, it seems to me, to argue that simply because there's some kind of connection to a granting agency that sponsored some time for the, writer to work, or that they may have spent some time, usually it's characterized as just during the, war against fascism, that just because there are some of these historically, verifiable connections, they're not uniquely going to pattern the work themselves, and that to highlight and point these out in any meaningful way is somehow going to reduce the ideas to patronage. Now, as somebody who works in cultural history, anybody who does art or art history, say even in the pre-modern world, the fact of patronage is just part of historical analysis. Nobody would genuinely talk about a work of art now in contemporary scholarship without acknowledging how maybe systems of patronage may not have, you wouldn't say it's less in terms of its artistic value necessarily, but you would argue that it suited the, interests of patrons, or that there was a market to attract patronage, and that you have to do that. So, how have you responded, or how would you respond to some of these reactions to the work that are very protective of, Adorno and Marcuse in particular, those you treat in this work, saying that, you're reducing, their very complicated ideas to being simple responses to the agendas of foundations or employers like the OSS and later the CIA. What's your response to these critiques and criticisms?
I think I'd say two things. The first is that what we're dealing with, for the most part, are cases of cultural commodity fetishism that are trying to insulate this ideal realm of high theory and culture from a materialist analysis. What they're saying is, some of them, at least the more extreme ones, it is verboten to bring the stars back down to earth. It doesn't matter who funded what, who was working for the State Department or not. What matters is their ideas, or what they've contributed to the kind of conversation across the centuries of philosophy or other such things. And so you see just a kind of dogmatic defense of the reification of an ideal domain above and beyond the material domain, and an attempt to preserve the realm of high theoretical culture, which is to be anticipated because it's an ideological reflex, right? They just don't want to critically reflect on the very constitution of that ideal realm, because it's what defines them as intellectuals. It's what gives them distinction from other intellectuals, like those who actually are serving the use value of, or using ideas for their use value, like many of the anti-imperialist Marxists. That's the first thing that I'd say. But the second is that I think a lot of these reactions also are a result of relying to a great extent on the liberal ideology that assumes that either there is a free individual who thinks on their own, or there's a determined structure that, in a reductivist sense, structures everything that person does, thinks, the way they talk, everything. And this polar opposition between freedom and determination is ultimately the result of being trapped within pre-dialectical thinking. It's actually very regressive historically. Since Hegel, and with Marx and Engels and the entire Marxist tradition, humanity, or at least segments of humanity, have moved beyond this reified polar opposition, because there isn't an individual, living in a vat somewhere, and there's not determined structures that absolutely condition every aspect of human life. Instead, there's a dialectical play of forces such that individual subjects emerge within a system of material relations that certainly conditions their lives to a large extent without completely determining them in at every level, and that those subjects also have agency that they can exercise over those systems. And so I think a better way of understanding some of my critical reflections on the figures of the Frankfurt School is that they did exercise their agency. But the way in which they exercised it is that they tended to sync it up with the conditional forces of the imperial superstructure. They, to put it more simplistically, they tended to use their agency to swim downstream. And so we can recognize their agency, we recognize the conditioning forces and the kind of synergy between the two. And what I'm advocating for is intellectuals who swim against the current, because they're not simply giving to empire the types of ideas that empire wants.
That reminds me actually very much, well, firstly, it something that I was talking with you about, this analysis that you have in response to these kind of critics, about this more complex relationship between subjective agency and objective, larger systemic structural conditions, and that there's a dialectical relationship between these things, and that people, of course, also are subjects of history as well. Over time, they may, change, they have to respond to new conditions and so forth. It reminded me that, one could maybe say something like, people make ideas themselves, but not the conditions under which they make them. They may have agency about some of the ideas that they come up with, but they are responding to, they don't have agency over the kind of state of the socioeconomic conditions in which they're operating. And so that's a way to kind of see in dynamic, dialectical, historical motion that understanding the larger systemic conditions is simply a matter of a sine qua non, an absolute necessity in order to really understand the subjective agency in its, objective conditions, right?
No, I love that. When we were talking about this earlier, you've kind of, in a very synthetic manner, paraphrasing, of course, Marx, brought together one of the fundamental themes of my book. And I wish we'd had this conversation earlier, because it's a real zinger, right? Human beings make their own ideas, but not in circumstances of their own choosing, right? That really brings together, as this famous sentence does, both elements of subject and system in their dialectical relationship. The other thing I'd add to this, and this is a slightly higher level of complexification, is that Lenin is also very clear and good on this, is that there are different ways of understanding dialectics. And Hegel himself pointed out that you can think dialectics at a level where you're still trapped at what he called the level of the understanding. And I'm going to keep this really simple, but what it means is that you think, well, there's a subject here and there's a system over here. And then you come up with all these complex metaphors for how they interrelate, interpenetrate, inform one another, et cetera, et cetera. But you're still thinking subject here and system here. If you actually materially analyze how the world works, there's never a subject over here and a system over here.
Right.
So it's a kind of reduction of dialectical thinking to the level of what Hegel calls the understanding, right? Or what Engels refers to as metaphysics. If we think at a higher level, a truly dialectical materialist analysis recognizes that, well, our language is limited. We talk about subject and system, but ultimately there are only subjects within systems, and there are only systems, if we're talking about systems within which humans participate, that have, you know, agential sites of human beings within them. And so we actually have to think all of this in terms of a process and a set of relations rather than terms of fixed nodal points. And that's more difficult to think. It's even more difficult to speak in these terms. But ultimately, that's closer to material reality. I'll close with this. Lenin has some excellent writings on dialectics where he refers to dialectics as many-sided thinking with the sides constantly increasing. So one of the goals of dialectics is to take our very limited conceptual apparatus and make it cohere better to the complexity of the reality that we're describing. And if we simply say subject and system, that's still not that great. If we can get to the point of elucidating how agents operate within complex conditional forces that themselves are constantly changing and map out all of the set of relations instead of reducing it to these two kind of polar points, then we have a much more sophisticated dialectical materialist analysis. And this is part of what I try to do in the book, is to bring that out, because you can't even, as soon as you try to conceptualize it in very synthetic terms, you begin to lose the fine-grained nature of it. And the process based orientation of, you know, everything that's going on and all of the interrelated connections. So I'll just add that as a kind of additional level philosophically that I think is extremely important.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because that really makes me think that one of the probably weaknesses of this kind of theory industry, or maybe you would even say the history of philosophy under liberalism or capitalism, is so much is around the kind of brand, as you might put it, of like the individual thinker, you know, and the brand of the individual thinker, and as the framework for trying to make all of these analyses. But in fact, actually, you put it nicely that the, you know, individually limited capacities that we have, there's so much actually complexity to try and work through, that in some ways, what you need in dialectical, historical, materialist approaches to thinking is that collective praxis, because it's going to be really too much for one person supposedly to understand everything. So, you know, that bringing more agents and more kind of in a different kind of, you know, practice is a much better way to apprehend reality for the use value of trying to improve and change society. So,
and just sorry to cut you off, but it makes me think of the conversation that we've been having here over the last 2 days, because there is a way in which, if you're able to collaborate with others and work through ideas, they bring their expertise, their vantage point, their skill set. And the more that you can collaborate like that, the better you can flesh out a more complex mapping of material reality. And when you think of what Marx did in his, like, as he developed, it was a collective project with Engels, of course, first and foremost, but then also it was embedded within the working class movement, and it was learning from the most developed sciences of the day. And that collective orientation is very different from the exchange value orientation. If you want to maximize the use value of your knowledge, one of the single best ways of doing it is to work collectively and get embedded within movements and intellectual developments that will enhance your ability to apprehend, describe, and hence ultimately change the complex material reality that you're trying to intervene in, right?
Yes, yes, yes. And actually, I think you have mentioned the contrast, between this kind of form of commodified theory production in imperial capitalist society that describes the conditions under which Western Marxism has pulled away from actual social movements, from actual, not even just pulled away, but condemning really existing socialism. Yeah. The contrast between that approach and somebody like Thomas Sankara, you were, telling me actually was such a telling, kind of the difference about what is the practice of organic intellectuals concerned with the use value. Maybe you could tell people a little bit about that contrast, or at least about what we could learn from Global South practice that is this more collective use value oriented approach.
Well, one of the things I appreciated about some of the things that we've been talking about is we identified a kind of primacy of theory among many of the members of the left intelligentsia in the West, but also beyond, in the kind of comprador manifestations and whatnot. And that consists in always being right.
Yes.
In branding yourself, in creating concepts so that you can market yourself, in having a singular and idiosyncratic philosophy of the world. When you think about this for just a hot second, it doesn't make any sense that the entire history of humanity would transpire, and then there'd be one individual who rises above and thinks a way of understanding the world that is so unique and so idiosyncratic that it surpasses anything anyone's ever thought before, and itself provides a kind of systemic understanding of reality. It is based on the illusion that individuals can, like genius figures, like messiahs, rise above the material world and somehow apprehend magically the ideal structure of that world. It not only makes no sense, but it's ultimately also grounded in this kind of commodified approach to ideas and intellectual production. Juxtaposed to that, we have the opposite, which is the primacy of practice. And if you're oriented towards the use value of ideas and the primacy of practice, then one of the most important things is to maximize the use value of your kind of conceptual framework. To do that, you need to work collectively. You need to get plugged into movements and material struggles on the ground, scientific developments, etc. But it's also true that if you look closely at the history of the dialectical and historical materialist tradition of the most rigorous sort, that there's a constant recognition that we as subjects are trying to understand and transform a complex material world whose complexity and whose functioning surpasses the ability of any individual to fully grasp it. So the best thing that we can do is develop the best possible map and set of strategies, and then we have to try them out in the real world. And very importantly, we have to have a constant feedback loop to see what works, what doesn't, and then quickly adjust. Lenin regularly said, it's not a matter of not making mistakes and just being correct and the primacy of theory and being on the sidelines. It's about correcting mistakes as quickly as possible. And Sankara is a great example of this because in a lot of his work, and I was involved for a number of years in a Sankara translation project to get more of his work available in English. And I'd read these interviews, and at times I was a little frustrated. I was like, come on, Sankara, like take a little bit of credit for the things that you're doing. But he would go on at length about all the failures, all of the mistakes that we've made. We didn't do this. We should do more of this. And we made, 62 mistakes and we made 3 advances. But he'd often add, this is better than the year before when we made, 75 mistakes and only 2 advances. And so a very rigorous, constant process of self-criticism based in the primacy of practice, where what matters is not being right and selling your brand and being correct and being the genius figure who intuits all things. What matters is changing the world. And to change the world, you have to do it as best as you can, while knowing that the world is more complex. And so you need to continue to learn from all of the different agencies and forces in the world so that you can try to move world history. Last thing that I'll say is this level of strategic thinking and the primacy of practice is in many ways the highest form of human thought. It's praxis, right? And the people who are able to do it are those who as individuals have actually transformed the path of human history. Think about doing that. That should be the goal, right? Not creating a brand, a new set of concepts. It should be, how can we actually channel the forces of history in order to move it in new directions? And to do that is an extremely difficult thing. And we have to learn from mistakes and ultimately chart territory that's uncharted. I mean, that's what socialism is. That's what actually existing socialism is. It's doing something that has never been done before. And of course, that's going to be difficult. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be setbacks, but it's a necessity. So it needs to be done.
Yes. It's also the case that because it's uncharted and there will be mistakes, the other component that has to be understood, and I'm just thinking of this in the context of the way in which, say, Iran is being criticized, just in similar ways that the Soviet Union was criticized, is that also at the same time, not only is it uncharted territory for which there is no, clear guidance. It has to be worked out through history in real time. Mistakes will be made. You have to adjust quickly. But you're also doing it not in a vacuum of
not in conditions of your own choosing.
Not conditions of your own choosing. This is exactly the problem. And those conditions have historically, of course, always come with incredible opposition to disturb, delay, disrupt, destruct, right, that project, because the transformation of the world means that for many people, they would be losing, right? Like if the bourgeois elite will do and must do everything possible to maintain the present world order. And so that seems to be also something that I think your book here is really one of the reasons perhaps why there's so much negative reaction in certain circles among the left, Western Marxist kind of intelligentsia and so forth, is that you go in a way further by arguing that it isn't just a matter that this is a kind of cul-de-sac that's not so useful because it's all about exchange value, but in fact that it turns out to have use value for the bourgeois imperialists. And that makes them complicit. It implicates them, and that is like a really bold kind of argument that has serious stakes and serious consequences. I'm wondering what you would say about, why you think it's important to recognize and realize that it isn't just a matter of it's some neutral obfuscation that, it was incorrect, it didn't really apprehend reality, its methods were flawed, and so, yes, it was a waste of time, let's go study this. It's more than that, it was a waste of time. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, why you think it's important to recognize in what ways it's more than that, which is, I think, also where a lot of the pushback comes in, because they're confronting the notion that it isn't a neutral endeavor to just be interested in ideas, but that in fact you are taking a position in what you call the intellectual world war.
That's such an important point that you raise, because our conversation earlier about the kind of uselessness of certain forms of intellectual production, you could say the same about certain forms of cultural production more generally, is ultimately inscribed within the imperialist world within which we live, within a usefulness for the capitalist ruling class. And one of the earlier studies that I did actually was on the apolitical art of the New York art scene in the wake of World War II, in which, Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and people like this, many of whom had been kind of leftist in the 1930s, but were explicitly apolitical, subjectivist, etc., in the wake of World War II. But it was broadly supported by the Central Intelligence Agency because they recognized that this useless apolitical art could serve the political purpose of shoring up the image of the so-called free world that they wanted to broadcast over and against the image that they wanted to broadcast of the Soviet Union and the East, which was that they were exercising so-called totalitarian control over cultural production, etc. So we always have to look at the social totality and all of the relations that are operative in cultural production. And so it's extremely important that you highlighted that. And in the case of the intellectuals in question, it wasn't only that they're doing this kind of exchange value based work, it's also that they served the interests of the imperial ruling class because they lined up on the single most important question, which is the question of imperialism, as well as their opposition to actually existing socialism, which is the greatest impediment that we've seen in material history to imperialism. And that is one of the reasons why they were promoted. And part of that also had to do with the overwhelming prominence of Marxism as both a scientific framework and a practical framework, particularly in the early Cold War, because communism had just defeated fascism, and communism was leading the struggle against imperialism in the Third World and the ongoing anti-colonial struggle that continued the anti-fascist war, but around the world. And so many recognized that, Marxism gave us the tools necessary to liberate us from fascism and imperialism. And so what a lot of the ruling class and the bourgeois states ended up doing is they tried to foster a version of Marxism that allowed the intelligentsia to hang on to an ostensible Marxist orientation, while nonetheless recuperating that within the logic of the free world, meaning the imperialist world, over and against actually existing socialism. And so we have to see how their subjective work was actually nested within this larger objective force field, if you will.
Yeah, and I mean, that's like from the system analysis that we were mentioning, that one has to look at those relations, and you do a great job in this work of tracing out some of these connections, the sponsorship through private capital in foundations, the deep state, CIA, OSS before that, and State Department, and then also academia, and doing the same kinds of things that had been done, in deep state research and analysis and intelligence, being basically offloaded onto academia to perform some of the same kinds of research for the same sorts of purposes, while clothed within the context of objective, ivory tower scholarship, immune and preserved from mere political.
That's the cover.
That's the cover,
yeah.
And that is cover, basically,
exactly.
essentially, yeah. So that is like, I think, a very important, kind of system sort of analysis in which to situate, this sort of work. One question that I might have also is, if one is attentive to that systemic political economy of the industry, as it were, and your critique of that, of the political economy of the theory industry, some people might, say, but aren't, these, kind of Western Marxists kind of historically situated, of course, in the problem that, communist revolution didn't happen in the industrial West. And so they took on this kind of analysis of what it was about capitalism that had managed to recover, appropriate, and defer revolution, even to the extent where they sort of started thinking it's impossible to have revolution, and they would, then serve kind of the depoliticizing, ends, of their patrons. But they did have some kinds of insights, and you say in response to others who might, or you say even through the book, anticipating perhaps that people might say you can't just reduce these complex ideas to the fact that, the CIA wrote a position paper saying that they wanted this work. Okay, we want to ignore that, but how can we ignore it? We can't ignore it. But okay, we could say that they still did all kinds of very rigorous, analysis, that they were incredibly intelligent. They did employ many Marxist concepts to understand late capitalism and its functioning. What kind of hermeneutics would you, as a result of the deep study you've done and reframing it, say we could apply to engaging with these works in order to really rethink what insights might have a use value, for us? How would we adjudicate that? How would you go about adjudicating that?
Well, one of the things I advocate for in the book and want to develop further is a dialectical hermeneutics. What I mean by that is that you always situate work within its complex set of material relations, which are, broad and varied. And you also situate it within a time frame so that you understand how it develops as a kind of process. And in doing that, you can identify different dimensions of particular forms of work. And some of the work produced by the Western Marxists is saturated with the most crass and dogmatic forms of anti-communism. When they say that Hitler and Stalin are basically equivalent and these types of things, they're just taking the line of the State Department and academically laundering it, either directly in certain cases or indirectly in others. But that doesn't mean that you take an entire body of work and you flatten it into a soundbite and you're done with it. No, you have to recognize a few things. One is that, as Marx and Lenin often insisted, bourgeois culture is the most developed form of culture that we have, because it leverages all of the power of, the predatory aspects of capitalism to develop the material conditions to advance intellectual developments to the highest level possible within the confines of capital. And so it would be shocking, actually, if within bourgeois culture there wasn't something that was, surpassed what, I don't know, underdeveloped peasant culture that's illiterate was able to develop, not making moral judgments about this, but just at the level of development, if you will. And it's also important to look through people's work and kind of identify different dimensions to it. So Adorno did very interesting and I think important work about the effects of emergent sound technologies and recording technologies on the music industry. That's interesting and important work, and some of it has a strong materialist orientation. Jumping to a completely different tradition, someone like Pierre Bourdieu, who abandoned some of the class analysis, but developed this notion of a habitus, which is an ingrained practical set of dispositions that is the result of, in kind of his language, playing particular social games. But he developed it in such a way that
could easily have said social class games.
Yes, of course. He would have had to change his whole framework to do that, but he could have. But what he's pointing to is the way in which, and I think this is useful as well, because we can't only look at Marxist work being recuperated by the kind of radical liberal intelligentsia, we also can find within that work that we would want to recuperate. And the notion of a habitus I actually find quite helpful if you strip it from some of Bourdieu's assumptions, because it really insists on the practical, embodied, dispositional elements of ideology. And there are certain Marxist tendencies, which I think are incorrect, that just think ideology is about the mind and particular ways of thinking and not about embodied dispositional habitus, if you will, which ultimately the habitus kind of brings together body and mind, if you will. And so there are also elements that we can kind of draw on and develop in different directions. And I think that is that's important. I mean, there's more that could be said about this, but in short, I think we need a variegated, complex analysis, not one that is reductive and simplistic. And it's humorous that some people who have most likely not read the book would
some of them even say, "Oh, I haven't read the book, but now I'm going to go and critique it," and
which is telling, right?
Yes.
Because
it's a lot like how they deal with really existing
and with the Marxist tradition, right? Where they say, well, why would you read Marx? We already know he's wrong. Well, how do you know he's wrong if you haven't read him? Or how do you know socialism doesn't work if you haven't studied it outside of the propaganda that you've imbibed from the bourgeois media and bourgeois academic work? And so that is, I think, a real fundamental problem. And there's also a kind of projection of reductivism onto a Marxist analysis. And one thing that I am increasingly learning through doing this work is that so many of the stereotypes that people apply to dialectical and historical materialism, that it's reductivist, that it's determinist, that it's economistic, that it predicts the future and pretends to be all-knowing, like there's many of them. We could go through the long list of them. They actually, in many cases, are just a projection of liberal ideology, because it's liberalism. Samir Amin's excellent on this. You want economic determinism, you want reductionism, look at the tradition of like liberal economic thought that wants to reduce everything to the economy or to the market, right? And that, do you want something that presumes to be all-knowing? Well, why don't we take them? Exactly. Or those who happen to know that everything about socialism is wrong. How do they have the presumption to know? You know, so much of that is just projection, and I think it needs to be called out for what it is, because it's turning the world upside down. No, that's important. I want to pause for a moment just to remind listeners that they can like the stream, subscribe to the channel, share it on social media. If you haven't liked it already, please go ahead and do that. I also want to say that I see that there's like an incredibly vibrant chat going on with lots of comments, and because this is a slightly different format, it's harder for me to read your comments and to see if you have questions and to put them up on the screen. So I haven't been as good about doing that. I'm going to endeavor to do so, and hopefully Gabriel recognized that I am listening, but I'm also looking at a distant screen to see how I might integrate some of your comments, critiques, and queries into the discussion. But I also want to remind people that, as I'm doing every Friday for the next several weeks, doing fundraisers for the Samir Project, okay, which is a Palestinian mutual aid organization that is providing collective solutions of resistance to help people maintain, you know, their living on the land, right? And so we know that there's so many individual appeals, and there are even great kind of organizations like Lifeline for Gaza that help you organize these appeals so that we can make sure that we're not forgetting people. They come to the top of the list. But I like the Samir Project because they're doing mutual aid and collective. So they're investing in infrastructure, in solutions to bring, you know, water in areas where they don't have potable water in, like, northern Gaza. And in the past, last week, we were part of the Ramadan Iftar campaign in particular. But I have great news. In addition to the, you know, maybe about just over £1,000 that we raised during office hours last time, is that the full $175,000 campaign has actually been reached already. So we're going to look for they have many other campaigns in the Samir Project. They have the Food and Water campaign. They have the Refat al-Arir camp, you know, and there's a number. You go to their site on Linktree, you know, it's linktr.ee/the Samir Project, and you'll see that they have Food and Water campaign, medical campaign, the Refat al-Arir camp, shelter, goods and activities, rebuild Gaza. And so I just want to encourage you, you know, even if the Ramadan Iftar campaign has achieved its goal, that although I'm not going to come and remind you several times more during the rest of this conversation, please do go and make a donation if you can. And we'll figure out which of the many campaigns for next week that we will highlight and support. And I want to thank everybody who gave in the past and for those who will give today. We have to do, you know, we're not about, I mean, we'd like to see solutions that are systemic, but in this situation that we're dealing with, if we can give and help, even if in this kind of occasional charitable way, we are still helping people maintain resistance against the empire. Let's do our part. So again, I want to thank you. I wanted to turn, since I just talked about empire, one thing that you have highlighted in this book is that one of the key problems and critiques one might have about Western Marxists is that they didn't really express solidarity with Global South campaigns against colonialism to free themselves. Their inability to really be clear about, you know, anti-imperialist politics
being central to a Marxist vision for a liberated future for humanity, that as a result and as a consequence, this was essentially the key contradiction of our time. And it's what really makes a distinction between other interpretations and understandings of Marxism that are true to the anti-imperialist spirit versus Western Marxism that really rationalized that, colonial control, or didn't even recognize, once colonial control, that there was something like maybe neocolonialism or imperialism still operating, And so, how would you say, what are the sort of intellectual resources for really challenging this Western Marxist inattention to the fundamental contradiction of imperialism and how that operates in the intellectual world war?
Well, I think we have to recognize that the Western Marxists are ultimately perhaps better described as Imperial Marxists, meaning that they are or embody the version of Marxism that has been promoted within the imperial superstructure. So that means a few things. One is that they're driven by the forces of empire, at least at the institutional level, and you can fight against that. You can swim, against the current, but many of them did not. And there's also differences of degrees. This is very important to insist on, right? As we were speaking earlier before the stream, it is the case that this isn't a moral judgment saying, well, someone is a Western or Imperial Marxist, therefore they're to be banished for all time, and somebody else is this pure non-Imperial Marxist. Like, there are two camps, but within individuals, it's also clear that there are different degrees and that we have to be attentive to that. So I thought that that was just important to highlight. But a lot of what you see under the Imperial Marxists is, or those who, are deeply embedded within Imperial Marxism, is a willingness to implicitly or explicitly not only condone, but often directly support imperialism. And there are many different ways of doing that. One of them is just to be blind to the question of global self-liberation and just ignore it entirely. I mean, Foucault's not exactly a Marxist, although some people have vaguely classified him as a kind of Western Marxist. He was an, anti-Marxist, but he generally just ignored the colonial question, except for in the case of what he referred to as the Soviet colonization of the East, which would be better described as the liberation of Eastern Europe from fascism and the authoritarianism that predated it. But a really key case, and this is actually the opening two chapters of the second volume of this trilogy, The Intellectual World War, deals explicitly with it, is that Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the French thinker from the mid-20th century, wrote a very important piece on Western Marxism in the mid-1950s. And I'll just highlight this as an example, because I think it goes to the core of why it is that the colonial question is central to all of the debates around Western Marxism or Imperial Marxism. Merleau-Ponty in the 50s during the Korean War decided, after having been a kind of fellow traveler of sorts and been a supporter of, what he referred to as a kind of attendant Marxism, like he kind of wait and see Marxism. He decided that he couldn't support the communists anymore because the Soviet Union hadn't, in his vocabulary, prohibited North Korea from invading South Korea. No analysis whatsoever of the material history of Japanese colonization, the ways in which the US came in and integrated the same basic structures of Japanese colonialism, including the so-called comfort women, which is just a euphemism for systematic sex slaves. On a grand scale. We're not talking about hundreds, we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands. There's some numbers even say hundreds of thousands of women subjected to this. And the colonial question is just completely obscured. You can't understand Korea and Korean history in the 20th century without centering colonialism. And it's fascinating that what Merleau-Ponty does in these texts is that he breaks with communism, says we can't even give a kind of fellow traveler or wait and see attitude towards communism. Instead, we have to shore up a communist left,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So it's
yeah.
precisely on the colonial question that he turns against communism, and then soon thereafter he's hired by the Alliance Française, which is basically a kind of diplomatic arm of the French government, to travel to Africa. He goes to Madagascar and other places, and then in interviews he says he's not for the independence of Africa, suggests basically that Africa's not ready for independence. I mean, he basically takes what are not resolutely pro-colonial questions, because he suggests, well, in the future maybe, but he defends a kind of one softer version of the French imperial project.
Yeah.
And so we have to see very clearly the extent to which a lot of imperial Marxism goes hand in hand with this defense of the colonial question. And it's not surprising that Adorno and Horkheimer were big supporters of Israel, and Marcuse as well, in spite of some of his earlier critiques. And that's what we have to really bring to the fore, is centering the primary contradiction and asking the question of, well, where do they stand on it? And they tend to stand on the side of empire.
Yes, yes, yeah. I mean, in some ways, I mean, I don't know if you would put it this way, but I mean, you know, some components of this imperialist Marxism, of Western Marxism, just maintains all the sort of Eurocentric, white supremacist presumptions, you know, of the colonial order. I mean, in so many ways. Well, this is like, you know, reminds me, this oppositional kind of component that is relevant and important. It just reminds me a little bit of Edward Said's, you know, representations of the intellectual. And he makes a big value out of like the intellectual as, you know, okay, it is a little heroic and it is a little bit idealist. But one thing that I appreciated about it is recognizing the key kind of problem of imperialism and colonialism, that and that the you know, responsibility of the intellectual is that they have to stand against that, even if, of course, it puts them in, you know, it means that they won't get as you know, many foundation grants, or they won't be, their work won't be published and circulated in the same kind of through the same mechanism.
Or they'll be publicly slandered as having peasant consciousness.
That's right. Exactly. That's right. Yeah, exactly. So at any rate, but I mean, the contrast between somebody like him, as much as he inhabited this privileged kind of position as a Columbia University professor and part of this kind of cosmopolitan, you know, elite, is that, you know, because of the, you know, the cause of Palestine, I think that was, I mean, he could have been just a real complete sort of, you know, kind of critical theory person and all of that. But I think because of the question of Palestine, he was in an oppositional position that allowed him to see solidarity with anti-imperialist and anti-colonial struggles as crucial, because Palestine fit into that as well. You know, so there is something very important and relevant to some of that post-colonial work, just like you were saying, okay, some components of what, you know, Adorno may have done about the music industry, like, and so this is useful to see, I think. But here's a figure, I mean, who did a lot of critiques of US empire, okay, who I think we should maybe talk a little bit about, because I think he fits into the pattern of a kind of compatible left. And certainly if you do the analysis of being embedded in the military, academic, industrial complex, and since you mentioned sexual slavery, I mean, so about Chomsky, basically, not that he was necessarily involved in any of that, but his, you know, these revelations about him in the Epstein files have been a real reckoning for many people who admired his kind of forensic kind of accounts of media occlusion of U.S., you know, crimes abroad, and imperialist interventions and so forth. And we've seen a lot of people kind of having to reckon with that, you know, in a sort of difficult sort of way. Do you think Chomsky really fits into this analysis of a kind of somebody who, even if he didn't say directly work with like deep state, nonetheless is embedded in a kind of
Well, he
Western
did
Marxism. Well, he did
work
kind of, yeah,
with-
he did. I mean, he did work for defense contractors.
Well, and also
things like that.
Epstein.
Yeah.
I mean, the full story has not come out, but obviously he's bound up in intelligence networks, and there are still questions that remain. But his father-in-law, of course, was Mossad, and so there, and it certainly looks like
you mean Epstein?
Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah. That's quite convincing. It seems.
Yeah, as well as the fact that he was friends with a man, Deutsche is his last name, right? Who became head of the CIA. This is Chomsky. And so he's definitely in those networks, and I think a very good example of the compatible left. But he's also an example of what we were talking about a moment ago, and the same I would say of Said, is that a moral analysis that simply tries to reduce the complexity of an individual's life to a good guy or a bad guy is not the same thing as a dialectical materialist analysis of a subject who develops over time and has a series of very complex relations. And so we have to rise above the simplistic moralism and actually do the difficult work of materially situating people. And it's the case that, Said did take some positions that were laudatory compared to Spivak, who was also at his institution, or other post-colonial theorists. He also was deeply affected by and even infected by a Foucaultian methodological framework that was not only non-Marxist, but anti-Marxist. You have to kind of see the different degrees. In the case of Chomsky, right, he was obviously very intelligent and capable of discerning certain fundamental elements in US foreign policy, and has done some scholarship that is certainly worth engaging with. At the same time, he was at MIT. A lot of his early research was funded directly by governmental institutions. MIT itself, of course, is basically, I mean, more or less an extension of
defense research.
Exactly. And even the research that he was doing, there's a very interesting book called Decoding Chomsky that looks at the type of research that he was doing in linguistics, and its ties to the attempts to develop various forms of machine learning that, of course, had applications within the defense industry and the arms industry and everything else. And Chomsky's always denied working directly on those types of projects, but it is quite obvious that the form of linguistic analysis that he was developing was, directly connected to these types of projects. Chomsky was also just a resolute anti-communist who, since I think at the age of 12, he decided that Lenin was a counter-revolutionary and that the Bolsheviks were just, totalitarians, and kept that 12-year-old mindset for his entire life instead of actually materially studying
anarcho-syndicalism. We've never seen it, but hey.
Exactly. Workers are just going to self-manage, and I kind of believe in it. So he is a good manifestation of a third-way politics that says, well, capitalism might have some problems. Actually, existing socialism is always a lot worse, right? But there's this magical third way of anarcho-syndicalism, and he's also quite liberal in a lot of his orientation.
Free speech absolutist,
so including for fascists. Very importantly, right? The fascists are the ones that we want to maintain a platform for. He also he also played a very important kind of gatekeeper role in not only casting a shadow over some of the work of others, like the great Michael Parenti, who just passed away, but then also he policed the kind of nature of public discourse by rejecting the very possibility of materially examining certain developments in US politics in particular that seem to implicate state involvement of a very nefarious sort. The JFK assassination is one example, 9/11 would be another, there are other examples. He was quote unquote anti-conspiratorial, which means that he just accepted the propaganda narrative that was put out often by the state. I mean, the head of the Warren, behind the Warren Commission, there was Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, who had been fired by Kennedy. And anyway, there's a whole series of connections that people should materially study. But instead, he was a kind of dogmatically defended what were the dominant bourgeois narratives. And so all of that, and much more that we could add, sheds a light on why it is that he is perhaps the leading leftist intellectual in the leading empire in the world. There is a reason for that. And compare him to Michael Parenti, and you see the entire trajectory of their careers where Parenti wasn't able to secure stable academic employment. He didn't have the translations and invitations and all the junkets and all of this. He didn't have the connections to the Epstein elite. He didn't have money directly overseen by, in the case of Epstein, it's not only that he was seeking financial advice and other things, but the Chomsky Challenge was funded by the foundation, Epstein's foundation, or one of them, to the tune of at least $20,000. And so there are also those direct types of contributions when you're, hanging out with the movers and shakers, so to speak. And all of that, I think, needs to be brought clearly into focus, which is that what we have is a compatible left intellectual who did do some important work, but ultimately was serving the interests of empire in being an anti-communist, and also in being someone who didn't center the primary contradiction in the way in which we need to understand it, which is imperialism isn't some contradiction that could be overcome if the US empire stopped being hypocritical based on the principles that they outline. The way you overcome imperialism is by the struggle to build sovereignty on the part of those subjected to the horrors of imperialism.
I think that's a very important point, because so much of his analysis was structured around this kind of dynamic of hypocrisy, or not fulfilling the stated, they say that this, but then let's look at the evidence here. But the framework here is essentially recuperative of the system. Because if we actually just force them to live up to their ideals, these are the best ideals. Like he says it. He says
it about the US.
It's the best country. The problem is that it is got flaws like everywhere else. And, the position of that kind of compatible left intellectual is to, challenge the US to live up to its ideals, kind of thing. I mean, this is, so that that's not going to be, the option of like, we need to revolutionarily change this system. Right?
Absolutely. That's such an important point, because ultimately then the horizon of our struggles is to improve the empire so that it is a softer, nicer version of, what will remain in an empire. And so there's a kind of almost idealist rationalism, right? Thinking that, well, you should just be coherent. If you say you're doing this, then you should actually do it, without recognizing that, well, there are material forces of imperialism that also produce cover for that imperialism, which is the dominant ideology, that of course is going to contradict it. And you don't solve the contradiction through reason. You solve the contradiction through material class struggle. What he says is, well, the material class struggle, that's just going to lead to horrors. Therefore, what we need to do is, overcome it by having it live up to its supposed ideals, which is ultimately, it's a third way that is impossible, because materially it cannot live up to those ideals, because then it would no longer be that system.
Well, I don't know if you have any sort of closing thoughts and remarks that you want to make, to the audience about kind of the importance of rethinking this, and for change. Last night you had, I thought, some very inspirational kind of remarks and conclusions, about why you wrote this book and what you hope it will achieve. We've talked a little bit about these critiques and so on, but I think ultimately what's more important is what this fits into in terms of the larger project. Like, so what would you say is the use value of your intervention here, for the cause of liberation?
Well, I think the overall goal, and I have no illusions about, how to put it, the ability to achieve these goals by publishing a single book, right? This is a grain of sand on a big beach, or use whatever metaphor that you want, but it's one small contribution to the attempt to reignite the flame of anti-imperialist Marxism, which is just the broad, rich, and deep tradition of dialectical and historical materialism in the real sense of that term, not the one co-opted and transformed by the revisionists and the imperial Marxists. And the need to do that is ultimately in the service of the project of liberating humanity from the horrors of imperialism and the unbridled levels of social murder, degradation, ecocide, endless wars, risks of nuclear apocalypse, the precarious nature of the lives that we have to live, where everyone under capital is, terrified that you might have medical bills and you'd be bankrupt, or that, there'd be a financial collapse and you wouldn't have a retirement anymore, or that you just couldn't find a job and that you're sleeping in the street, or that you wouldn't, there's many, many things that just render us as subjects under capitalism fraught. And it's not surprising. There's so many psychological problems and so many social pathologies, because this system is a system that grinds down and destroys human life for the purposes of profit. And we need to break with this system, and we are already breaking with it. Humanity, you always have to center not only the primary contradiction, but you have to be a resolute internationalist and a humanist in the real sense of that term, and look at all of humanity. And all of humanity has been developing tools for breaking the chains of imperialism, and we have to do that. And we also have to do it extremely quickly, because of not only ecocide and the forever wars, but because the imperial powers now see arguably more clearly. I mean, they saw it very clearly with the Soviet Union. That's one of the reasons that fascism was developed, to try to destroy it, but they failed. But in our historical conjuncture, at least in my lifetime, imperialism is under threat by the rise of the global south, the rise of China, in a way that it hasn't been under threat as much when it was more of the kind of so-called unipolar world. And that creates a situation where they're increasingly shifting away from bourgeois democratic forms of rule towards, and fascism is a process, not just a state of affairs, but they're going increasingly in an anti-democratic direction. And they're doing that quickly because the clock is ticking for the financial ruling class. And if they lose empire, then they lose the status that they have. And it's not just individual choices, right? There are material forces that are driving all of this. And so I hope that the book, in some at least small way, contributes to the struggle of human beings against the forces of empire that are destroying the conditions of possibility of life. And in order to do that, we have to reignite a real left, a left that recognizes that the way you defeat imperialism is by creating projects of human sovereignty. And sovereignty is something that needs to push back forcefully against the forces of empire, and it needs to consolidate power that's in the hands of the people. And that project is the only project that is going to be able to save not only humanity, but the planet. And so it's a clear and stark choice. And those who don't like camps don't have any choice about it when it comes to material reality. You can try to climb back into your mind or seek out some type of spiritual recourse above and beyond the real world. But in the real world that we live in, it's very clear that it's either empire and death and destruction, or it is human liberation and hopefully the salvation of the planet. And that is the choice that's facing humanity. And it's one in which I think we all have our part to play. And it's the most important class struggle of our times, because it's the struggle for the future. Is there going to be a future, or is there not? And there is not a future with imperialism. There is not a future because it will destroy the conditions of possibility of life. That's the situation that we're in. And in that sense, the book is trying to give a clear theoretical framework to the horizon of our struggles, so that we orient ourselves to learning from this deep and rich collective tradition, pushing it forward so that we can develop the theoretical and, most importantly, the practical tools necessary to fight and win against empire.
Absolutely. Well, we're all in an intellectual world war. We're in a world war. This hostility to defining one's position in a camp is not going to contribute. I mean, it's first, you have to also decide which camp, but this idea that you shouldn't be in a camp is part of this obfuscatory sort of third way. And I guess that's what we're kind of learning. Like, you're either really an anti-imperialist and on the side of human dignity and life, or you're part of this, disgusting. We're learning more about how disgusting every day with these, revelations and so forth. But these are all very predictable because capitalism has always been a criminal affair, and it will do anything to try and co-opt resistance. And that's what I think really the book is so helpful in doing, is giving us some of the intellectual tools and the clarity to prevent ourselves from being co-opted into, even sometimes when it might seem, the apolitical or both neither this nor that, being too correct. But actually we have choices to make. And your book really helps us think through that there is really only one clear choice if we stand for humanity and freedom and liberation. So I thank you so much for making.
Can I say just one final thing about this? Is that you can subjectively think that you're not in a camp or reject campism. That doesn't change the nature of the objective world. And in fact, echoing back to our earlier conversation about the uselessness of certain forms of intellectual production, is actually very useful to empire. We can say the exact same thing about the anti-campism, that this magical third way world without camps is itself a subjective position that serves objective interests of one very specific camp, which is the camp of empire. And so the choice is not between being a campus and being a non-campus. It's a choice between whether or not you have the subjective illusion of a magical third way in which you could live in a world in which there wouldn't be a fight between imperialists and anti-imperialists, a world that doesn't exist. And if you live in that world, you're actually objectively shoring up, implicitly or explicitly, the forces of empire. And so the real choice needs to be with an anti-imperialist camp that positions itself against the objective reality of an imperialist camp that includes the subjects within that camp that operate under the illusion that they're not in a camp. Right?
Yes. That's like Alice in Wonderland or something, some weird fantasy that they could be. But it's...
Well, it's also a petty bourgeois, imperial intellectual position, people who can afford to think that they're not in a camp. Most people in the world, the overwhelming majority of humanity, is subjected to forces that don't give them that luxury.
Yes. Well, this has been really wonderful conversation and follow-up, and I'm so much looking forward to also further comments later this evening. But I want to thank all of you for being part of this conversation. As I said, I found this format very engaging because I'm here live in person with my guest, Gabriel Rockhill, but it means that I wasn't able to read and monitor as many of the comments. I tried to. If you had questions, I'm sure these things will come up in future discussions and so forth, and I will look back through the chat to kind of bring out some of these important topics and queries for further discussion and analysis, future office hours and future programs. But I want to thank you all for coming. Before you leave, you could also still, again, like the stream, subscribe to the channel, and share it out so that people can go back and watch and listen to this conversation, and hopefully get a better sense of why they should go buy this book and read this book, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism. It's volume 1 of the Intellectual World War. I'm really looking forward to future volumes in a 3-part series, 3-volume series. And of course, we'll have you come back and talk about volume 2 and also volume 3. Don't forget about the Samir Project before you go. Please make a donation if you can. Until next time, peace and solidarity. Well, peace with justice and solidarity.